But we do have really a phenomenal panel here today coming up. This is entitled, We Were Strangers Too. And we conceived of this idea for this panel before we really knew what the political climate was going to look like today. What we did know, however, was that over the past year, year and a half, we have been seeing xenophobia, anti-immigrant rhetoric, anti-refugee rhetoric that was once confined to the extremes and was once thought to be embarrassing to actually say out loud. And it was taboo. And now, unfortunately, it has come into the mainstream. And just about a year ago, actually, after the horrendous attacks in Paris and in Belgium, we saw this incredible backlash against refugees who are fleeing for their lives, particularly from Syria. Although we're seeing the largest refugee crisis since World War II from places much more than just Syria, from all over the world. But we saw this backlash against Syrian refugees. And I personally felt this very deeply because my grandparents were German Jewish refugees. And when they were trying desperately to leave Germany in the 1930s, they couldn't come to the United States. The US had shut its doors. And so they ended up in Bolivia. Bolivia was the only country in the world that would let them in. And so my mom was born in Bolivia. She grew up in Uruguay. And so she is a Latin American immigrant. And so this is my personal story, and it felt very personal to me. And I don't think that other people in this room have that same story, but many of us have similar stories. I think many of us in this room either have ourselves come to the United States or have parents, grandparents, great-grandparents who are either fleeing extreme violence, who are fleeing war, who are fleeing religious persecution, or who are really looking to make the United States a home and looking for a place of opportunity and for a better life here. And so we were strangers too. This is something that is very familiar and very personal to the Jewish community. And so on Passover, this past Passover, we launched a campaign, We Were Strangers Too. We partnered with the Creative Action Network, which is a group of 10,000 artists from around the world, and we asked them to create artwork with the theme of We Were Strangers Too, because we feel that really a picture is worth 1,000 words, and it can communicate and touch people's hearts in ways that other things can't. But the other thing that can really touch people's hearts, I think, in a really unique and particular way, is to hear individual stories. Not just stories about how many millions of people have been displaced from their homes, but actually the stories of what's happening. Not just about, the 11 million undocumented people who are living and working and contributing to our society, but what it means to be undocumented and what that experience is. And so today, I am really thrilled to have the panelists that we have here. So to my right is Ilse Melamid. She was sent to England at age 11 on one of the last Kindertransport trains to leave Vienna in 1939. Her parents hoped that they would only be separated for a short time, but she did not see her parents again. Traumatized by her experience as a refugee, she acquired only a little education. From the age of 14 on, Ilse lived independently. Eventually, she was united with family members who had fled to Australia, and other members of her family who had fled to the United States persuaded her to make her life here in the United States. Then in the middle is Diana Eusebio. She's a program associate at the New York State Youth Leadership Council, which is an undocumented youth-led organization whose goal is to give undocumented youth the tools and space to organize and create change in their communities. In 2011, Diana moved from Florida to New York after seeing the impact of the Secure Communities program, which separated families there. She said that her proudest moment working with the NYSYLC was on a trip to Washington, D.C. with her father and her brother as part of the organization, where she wore a shirt that said, "Undocumented, unafraid, unapologetic." And then last but certainly not least is Sussan Khozouri, who's the Senior Vice President of HIAS, a phenomenal organization that we partner with all the time and that we really consider as very valuable partners in our work on refugee rights. Sussan oversees global programs in the US, Latin America, Africa, Israel, and Eurasia. She joined HIAS in 2013 after serving as Assistant Executive Vice President at the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. Her expertise includes program management in refugee resettlement, relief, reconstruction, and civil society building in the US and overseas with the American Refugee Committee, the International Rescue Committee, the Women's Commission for Refugee Women and Children, and the Open Society Institute. And Sussan also sought asylum here in the United States. So please welcome our amazing panel. Ilse, I'd like to start with you. If you could take us back to 1939 and what that was like on the Kindertransport.
Yeah. Well, excuse me if I refer to some notes. I thought I'd start with a little bit of history. After the Anschluss of the Nazi government in 1938, leaders of Jewish community in Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia became increasingly alarmed. Men had been rounded up and put into concentration camps. Visas to flee were hard to get. Just like now, the rest of the world did not want refugees. And Jewish children were ejected from the schools. This was particularly painful for a child to find out that the friends that sat and played with her were suddenly enemies. We were not allowed to talk to them, and they did not wish to talk to us. Very puzzling. However, a few determined men and women in Germany and England were able to persuade the British government to grant entry without visas to children under the age of 17, and provided there were some guarantees about their welfare and their possible need for funds. They had the same ideas that they did not want to be saddled with refugees. But fortunately, someone made an impassioned plea at the House of Commons, and the Kindertransport started. My father had already been in a concentration camp for a year when my mother listed me and my younger sister to participate in this transport out of Vienna. As you said, I was on one of the last transports before the war started. And the children were taken into homes, group houses, and the organization was very efficiently done by people, mostly churches and synagogues participated. And in the course of that year, almost 10,000 children were accepted in Britain. Although initially, of course, there was a lot of pushback. Children were taken into families, and many of them had wonderful experiences of being made very welcome. Others were not so successful. I was 11 years old, and I felt this was an adventure, and I had no thought that I would not see my parents again. My mother and sister perished in Auschwitz, and my father was interned again. I was taken in by a Christian couple who had no children. It was not a very happy experience, but they saved my life. Of course, all this would never have happened had my mother not had the courage to send me away. Think about that. My father escaped to Italy, hoping he would find a safe place for his wife and child. But before he could do so, he was arrested again. The day before he left Vienna, he wrote into my diary, this little shabby book here. imploring me to be dutiful and diligent, and trusted me to do my best among strangers. He hoped that my young years would be filled with joy and laughter. Most of the children saved by the transports never saw their parents again. Some remained in Britain, while others joined families that had survived in America and Australia. Like most others, I became self-reliant, determined to do my best and fulfill my father's hopes. So why am I telling you this story? Hearing about the thousands, even millions of refugees on the move makes one feel just helpless. About all one can do is to give generously to the organizations like HIAS, trying to provide conditions for survival. I want you to take away the notion that a refugee can become an asset to society. The good people and communities some typing errors. What I wanted to say is that there are people who are not prejudiced against people from the Middle East, from Africa and Europe. And we should not make the stranger into something that we dread. I want you to go away imagining the circumstances of a child, a parent, a family, and let your response to their suffering incite you to action. Make it known that you are willing to offer a seat at your table. Thank you. Now you might have some questions. Does that?
I think so. I think we'll have everybody. But if you want to go on your phones and into the app, then I will be looking for questions there.
I see.
So thank you so much for sharing your story with us.
Yeah.
And Sussan, I wanted to. I'll
start with me.
I'll start with you next. So you were seeking asylum in the United States at a very different time.
Right. So by background, by nationality, I'm an Iranian, Iraqi, Lebanese Jew. So it's an unusual combination. I grew up basically in Iran with my grandmother. I was an orphan, and I'm just going to say that the story that we just heard now, and I'm guessing the story that we're going to hear, one thing that goes across the board with all refugees, asylum seekers, I think the four of us, our story, and probably many of your narratives, is two things. The need for security and documentation, because so many of our families, when we were displaced and fled persecution, were looking for the document that made us legal, because you're pretty much invisible unless you're registered and legal. And the other common narrative, in I think all of our stories, is very much the kindness of strangers. And you spoke about that very eloquently. And so I think your kindness and your generosity moving forward in this conversation, but also just our commitment to human rights and to refugee protection is an important one. I'll tell you my story, but I'll also very quickly just tell you about HIAS, the organization that I work for. So for those of you who may know it by another name, it's formerly the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. HIAS probably brought almost every American Jew that came through to the US in a refugee-like situation, and also immigrant situation for about 130 years. And what we did then is no different than what's done today. And then I will go into my own story, which is people would come to America. We worked very often with the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. Many of you may know it as the Joint, where we helped feed people in countries, host countries, where they lived after their flight for persecution. And then HIAS is the organization that actually worked on people's immigration, bringing them either to the United States or to Latin America or to parts of Asia after World War II. But HIAS was the migration organization, and it still is. The good news is there's less Jews today who seek any kind of refugee status or asylum. And our job has changed from resettling and assisting Jews to continuing the work of refugee assistance and refugee resettlement. At our height, we resettled 50,000 Soviet Jews a year during the Soviet influx to the US, people fleeing the former Soviet Union for maybe 3-4 years in a row. So if you think about it, today America is talking about 75,000, 110,000 refugees coming to this country. There was a period in HIAS's history where we were resettling 50 to 60,000 refugees a year in this country, just ourselves, and our sister agencies were resettling other refugees from Vietnam, from the communist countries. So America has a long, long tradition of resettling refugees. So my own story is very typical. My grandmother and I lived together in Iran. My grandparents were involved in building the synagogue for our community in Iran, the Iraqi Babylonian community. I don't know if anyone here is from that community. And when the revolution happened in Iran, my grandmother and I stayed behind waiting to see what would happen. And there was pressure on my grandmother to get me out of the country from my mother's side of the family that was Lebanese. And we fled through Turkey. We took smugglers and fled Iran. So you can imagine the story of many refugees is that of the escape route, which is a very, very difficult one. And very often it's women and children. So we fled to Turkey. And in Turkey, when we arrived, there were hundreds of thousands of other Iranians, and there were Afghans and other nationality groups who were seeking resettlement. Only 1% of the refugees worldwide probably get resettled somewhere. And the lines are really long, and the wait is very, very long. Being Jewish, we had another option, right? We went to Israel. I had an uncle who was in jail for being a Zionist in Iran. My grandmother wanted to go back there to see what happened to him and to my aunt. And so I ended up getting false documents to come to the US. And at that time, asylum seekers, unlike now, were able to get work authorization during the period that you were getting your asylum proceedings decided on. So ironically, for about 11 years, I was in asylum proceedings. And the reason that I kept being rejected was because I was in Israel for 3 months. And the fact is that there was recognition that I had another option, another home. But the fact is that as a 16-year-old with my grandmother in Iran, I just couldn't choose to be in Israel when the only person that I ever grew up with, I wouldn't be in touch with. And so we were fighting that battle, and even more ironically, I was the director of resettlement for the International Rescue Committee at the time that I did end up getting amnesty in America because of a law that Ronald Reagan had passed to give people who had been in asylum proceedings for about 8 years from 1982 onwards who could prove that they never left the country. Well, of course, I could prove it because I was almost going to get deported. My third time, I was rejected. And then I got amnesty, and that's how I ended up staying in the US. And so that's my personal story. So refugee resettlement and refugee assistance has been sort of a lifetime vocation for me. And for me, it's been a very fortunate thing because it's an unbelievable thing to be able to give back after you've been on the other side. And actually, when I was at IRC at the time and I did get my amnesty, I had told them that wherever it is in the world that there was a refugee crisis, I wanted to be on the other side giving people their papers. And so I ended up working in Croatia when the Bosnians were coming out of that country. And I had the honor and privilege then of working on a contract for the US government that at that time 9,000 Bosnian refugees came to the United States, and my office was responsible for all of those. I went and saw every refugee family leave at the airport. And so for me, it's been both a personal and a professional commitment. But in short, that's my story.
Thank you. And I think we are also grateful that you have made that commitment. And so, Diana, I wanted to turn to you because Sussan mentioned that the quest is always to find documents and to get documents. So you didn't come to the US as a refugee, and you are here and you are undocumented. So can you tell us that story?
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank the Anti-Defamation League for having me here and for sharing a slightly different perspective that my community faces and the stories that I carry with me as I sit here. My name is Diana Eusebio. I am undocumented, unafraid, and unapologetic. It is really important for me to state this and start with this because it is something that, especially in the climate after the election, people want us to hide. People want us to not tell the stories, and I will not do that. The organization that I'm currently working at will not shut its doors. We will continue to fight, and so I will start with my story now. I was born in Mexico. I'm from the state called Puebla. I lived with my father, mother, and three siblings until my mother passed away when I was 6. At that time, my dad made a difficult decision to take his children and protect them from a lot of the violent relationships that were happening in my town after my mother passed away, with his family members wanting to separate us and not thinking that he was capable of raising three children. So at the time, I was 6 years old and I didn't know what was happening. I just remember traveling from city to city, making our way north towards the border. I remember hiding in the bushes of the border, under bridges, running, having things stuck to my boots, to my pants, and just hiding at the time. I remember getting tired of walking. We walked for 3 days and 3 nights. That was a lot for a 6-year-old. And then once we made it across the other side, we were then placed on a flight to Florida where my aunt was living at the time. For me, it seemed fine. I was 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and I was going to school. I learned English, something that is very, very difficult for immigrants to do. And for me, it was a happy, normal life until 2011, when my brother was stopped for driving without a license in Florida and other parts of the country that is very important. And even though we couldn't get a license, it was necessary for us to go to school, to go to work, to go grocery shopping, to go to church. It was necessary, so there was no question as to why he had to do it. Unfortunately, that led him to be placed into deportation proceedings. He already had a family at the time, a 1-year-old and a wife, both US citizens, but my family remained undocumented. Then my dad made another choice to move to New York City. He heard rumors that New York City was safer for us, that he didn't have to make the choice whether to go to school or go to work, that we could live in a peaceful environment. and that what he wanted to do was to make sure that me and my other brother continue to have an opportunity at a great education. I came to New York City. I started high school here, and moving, just having all those transitions in my life, even if they were for the greater good, just really put me in a place where I didn't know what was possible. On the news, I was hearing the word illegal. I was hearing deportations. I was seeing how in Florida, families that I had grown up with, friends, their parents, were being deported. And so for me, it just felt like, that's it. I'm not gonna go to school. People don't want me to go to school. People don't want me to succeed. Until I found an organization online, and this was just by me Googling undocumented, dreamer, just the keywords, Google, and came across the New York State Youth Leadership Council. I've been a member with them for 4 years. I started just going to a training, and when I first stepped into one of their trainings, I was like, what is this? Why are people saying undocumented out loud? Why are people talking about their status? They're crazy, they're gonna get deported. The same thing is gonna happen to them that happened to my brother, and I don't want that to happen to them. So I just went to another one, and then before I knew it, I was sharing my story. I was sharing what had happened to my family in Florida. I was listening to other people's similar stories where they had fled their countries for other reasons, and they had settled here, and how they were going to school, and that gave me hope and gave me that motivation to continue school. I graduated from high school in 2015, and I also was in a program that allowed me to study college. So I graduated with a high school diploma and an associate's degree. And then I did another program where I was able to intern a corporate of 100 company. So and the reason why I was able to do that because of this program, this executive order called Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And if anyone has been following what President-elect Donald Trump has been saying, it will be the first thing in his 100 days that he will take away. And so for me and the work that I do as a program associate at the New York State Youth Leadership Council is something that is very real to us. People had made their lives, people had went to school, people were studying for their doctorate to be lawyers, and all of a sudden, this is gonna be taken away. A 2-year work permit, a 2-year protection from deportation. This is all gonna take away, and at the time right now, we're thinking about how we're gonna continue to stay strong, and how we're gonna continue to live our lives, even if this is taken away. So, I'm a beneficiary of that program. I have deferred action. I've been able to work. I've been able to go to school because of that. And so I'm here to really let you know that what this deferred action and any other program for people to see the faces and continue to share the stories of who is going to impact. If President-elect Donald Trump says he's going to deport undocumented immigrants, it will be me, it will be my family, it will be my community. It will be a human impact. Thank you.
I, for one, am so incredibly happy that you are unafraid and unapologetic. And for decades, ADL has been working on immigration reform, standing with immigrants, standing with refugees, and we certainly have no plans to change that. And in fact, we're going to double down. So my question to you is, how can we stand with you? How can we as an organization, how can we as individuals stand with you?
Yeah. So as an organization, one of the key things we've been doing is for the immigrants, not just in the city and other parts of the country, is to continue to let them know what their rights are. Even if they're undocumented, one of the key things is for people to know their rights. This comes with a lot of fear of like interaction with police or any authority department. People should be able to call if there's a problem And that's one of the huge things we're right now working on, like knowing your rights trainings when it comes to employment, to police interactions. That's one way. Another way is to remember our stories, to carry them whenever you're sitting with someone that can potentially impact someone's decision in the story and how they view, and to also stand with us, to not let it slide, as we say, if someone says something about immigrants, something xenophobic, to not be okay with it, to not be quiet. It's hard for us to be like, that was wrong what you said and this is why. It's really hard, and we will continue to do that. But if we have people with us saying the same thing and not keeping quiet, then I think that's one of the things that people can do on their day-to-day lives. They have people who they can impact.
Absolutely. So Sussan, it's only been a week since the election, or a little over the week since the election. But what is HIAS thinking in terms of moving forward and what the challenges are?
So for us also, there's probably, like everybody in this room, a lot of unknowns. Did you lose them? Is it back? Okay.
Back.
So our position, like yours, is to double down, to make sure people are not afraid to talk about welcoming the stranger, and to really push forward our education and information campaigns. We also have a campaign called Welcome the Stranger. For us, we talk very often in synagogues and communities around the country that the Torah says 36 times to welcome the stranger, and that the refugee narrative is also a Jewish narrative. And for us, I think the advocacy, the education, the information is really critical, and to absolutely keep humanitarian aid up and not to end it. Because, you know, when we saw all those refugees show up in Europe, the reason that they showed up in Europe because the World Food Program just couldn't afford to keep feeding all those people in the countries of first asylum. And basically, you know, people started walking, and if America doesn't show its leadership, we're going to see a lot of breakdown of a refugee regime that's actually been working until now, you know, and America is involved in the real leadership of this humanitarian protection program for refugees. And if America steps back, then every country will step back. Kenya will say, I don't want to host them. Uganda will say, I don't want to host them. Afghanistan will say, and it will just keep going. And the ripple effect will be huge because there's 65 million refugees and displaced people in the world today.
Thank you. So, Ilse, you were on your own from age 14 on. And today we're hearing so many people who are refugees, young people who are by themselves, or people who are undocumented, who are here, who came by themselves. Do you have words of advice for people of how you got through that?
Well, I think you have to live very carefully. And, but you have to continue to trust your fellow man. I guess that's something that's probably born or that you get from the way you're raised, that basically you have a good response to people.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Sussan, one of the things that we have heard a lot about over the last year with refugees is that it would be dangerous to let them in, the danger that they pose to the United States. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think you mentioned it, that refugees have always looked dangerous to the United States or any country where they're welcome, because they're fleeing persecution, and sometimes opening doors to people who are fleeing persecution and who are homeless is a risk, right? But we've been doing this for 130 years, and how many refugees have really created problems? But that aside, and you hear this all the time, the security clearances for these people are not simple, right? What's changed over the past 40, 50 years is there's so many security clearances. Even when I was working in Croatia, refugees have to be registered with the UN. Their stories have to be corroborated by the UN that has actual staff in a lot of the places where they originated from. And then there's a lot of biometrics, there's fingerprinting, there's security, there's American Security, Department of Defense, Department of State, Homeland Security. There's interviews and interviews and interviews, at least 4 interviews that they have to go through. But there's a lot of security clearances, and it's not just American, it's with the British, it's with the Australians, it's with the French, it's with the Germans. So people go through a long process. And it's not like you're a refugee today and tomorrow you're going to be admitted. Sometimes people wait 5 years, sometimes 10 years, sometimes 15 years. And then if you've waited that long, your story, you have to be interviewed again, you have to do your fingerprints again. And so it's a complicated process. Is it perfect? No, but it's pretty close to perfect so far.
Great.
You know, the longer you put people in these situations and the longer there's hunger and displacement and uprootedness, the more you're opening a situation where people are more and more vulnerable. And when people are vulnerable, you can't predict what they act like. But refugees, you know, so many times you see refugees and people say, I watched TV and I saw Somalia and I never thought I would be Somalia. I watched TV and I saw Bosnia and I never thought I would be Bosnia. But it can happen to anybody.
Mm-hmm. So, Diana, I wanted to flip the question on its head a little bit. And that is that there's been so much of a narrative about refugees being dangerous or immigrants being dangerous. There's been this really awful rhetoric about immigrants being dangerous. But our concern has been the danger to immigrants, which has unfortunately really increased over the past week, that we've seen a number of hate crimes, a number of reports from schools where middle school students are forming a human wall to block Latino students from getting to their lockers. Real hatred that's coming out. So I'm wondering whether you have experienced any of this or whether you're hearing anything from the undocumented community about what's going on.
I personally haven't experienced any of it. Living in New York City, I am thankful for having a space where that hasn't happened to me personally. I have heard of the ones that are going to be mostly impacted, and I have seen this with my own family, is the children. The children of the undocumented parents, the children of people, dreamers, undocumented youth who then grew up, were able to make their lives with deferred action, and now all of a sudden don't know if their parents are going to be in place in deportation proceedings. Those are the children that are going to be the most affected. And I have a friend who has a child. The child is a U.S. citizen, and just going to school, there was a conversation where the teacher should have intervened when the students are having this conversation, where they were telling her, your mom is going to be deported. And what does that do to a child at that age to hear that? I have seen what deportation does to what it did to my nephew, who has been separated from his father for 5 years. He is now 6 years old, and it is really difficult to see him cry in the middle of the night, to wake up and is like, I miss my dad, or to be at a family gathering and just be like, I really miss my dad. And that reflects in his school grades, that reflects whenever we have conversations if he's acting up, because we have to get deep into what really is the root cause. And through those conversations, I realized that this is going to impact when they get older, those children who are now 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, and they get older, and then now at that time we're going to be questioning what happened to these children, why did they become so violent? And hopefully that's not the case, but this is the effect that it will have to them, because growing up with like one family without family there can have really bad effects on a child's developmental stages. And for me, that's why it's really important to state that's what my biggest concern is, and how do we work with those children?
Yeah.
Can I?
Yes, please.
Just two things. One is a story and one is a comment about refugee resettlement. So HIAS is also nonpartisan, like you. But the day after the election, all of us sort of were in the office, and I asked one of my Afghan colleagues how she was doing. And she's a beautiful young woman. She works with clients that, you know, the US has friends, people who worked for the US government in Afghanistan and Iraq, and people who are associated with the US come to the US under a special visa. So she works with those cases. And she said, you know, I was so shocked this morning. My nephews and nieces woke up in the morning and they said, Mommy, Mommy, what happened with the elections? And she told them. And then they started crying, and she said, what's wrong? And she said, Mommy, are we going to be deported back to Afghanistan? And they said, we're Muslim, but we're not bad. And so now how do we go to school today? And so kids are feeling this, right? Muslim kids are feeling this. Latin American, Central American, children are feeling this because they heard this in the news for so long. And the other thing I want to say is, so the US resettlement program is something that comes through because of presidential determination every year. The program is part of America's humanitarian assistance program, generally worldwide. But we rely on individuals all over this country, communities all over this country. There's 9 resettlement agencies, most of them faith-based. We're the Jewish ones. There's evangelical, Lutheran, Catholics, et cetera, with 2 non-sectarian, the IRC and USCRI, US Committee for Refugees. We depend on local communities to welcome refugees, right? It doesn't work if neighbors don't welcome neighbors, if people don't want the kids in school, if people are closing doors and building walls, right? And so that's the biggest terror to our program, is just that this inflammatory rhetoric makes people literally not welcome. And that's the hardest thing to deal with, I think.
Well, I would love to continue this conversation for much longer, and I will promise you this, Diana, that we will continue to amplify your story and the stories of other undocumented immigrants, and that we will continue to work with HIAS to fight for refugee rights. We will continue to be working for immigrant rights, and that is certainly not going to end, and we will stand up whenever there is xenophobia, whenever there is bigotry, whenever there is hatred. So we will be there with you. And that I can promise. So we unfortunately need to come to an end for candle lighting, but I do want to encourage you, as you go out to the lobby later, some of our artwork from the We Were Strangers 2 art campaign is going to be out in the lobby, so I would encourage you to look at it. So please join me in thanking our fantastic panelists.